Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the area of Microsoft 365 development. And I have a lot of experience with SharePoint development, including all of the different development models that we've had, Microsoft Graph development, Microsoft Teams development, and developing add-ins for Microsoft Office, as well as working with Microsoft Identity, including Azure AD. Tabs are Microsoft Teams aware web pages embedded in Microsoft Teams, and they can be added as part of a channel or group chat inside of a team or as a personal app for an individual user. As part of your app, you can add custom tabs to embed your own web content in Microsoft Teams. There are two types of tabs available in Microsoft Teams: channel tabs and personal tabs. And in this module, you're going to learn how to create tabs and add them to your Microsoft Teams app. What are we going to cover in this module? In this first section, we're going to look at a Microsoft Teams extensibility overview. We're going to look and see what the tabs are all about, and then how to create custom tabs for Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams enables developers to create custom experiences for users. For the best and most extensible option for adding your service into Microsoft Teams, you're going to create a Microsoft Teams app. A Microsoft Teams app is a package of services that you host that can be distributed through the Teams product or uploaded by owners. These apps can consist of custom tabs, bots, messaging extensions, or webhooks and connectors. For quick one-off integration of your existing webhooks, you can take advantage of Microsoft's webhooks and connectors feature. This ad hoc extensibility option allows you to set up webhooks and notifications in a specific team with no additional configuration required. Apps in Microsoft Teams allow you to make your service available to users in the contexts or scopes that make the most sense. You declare precisely which capabilities you support and which scopes via your package manifest file. Microsoft Teams apps capabilities, such as bots, tabs, and so on, are available in most scopes. These capabilities are offered via a single Microsoft Teams app package that users can acquire through the Microsoft Teams in-product app gallery, the Office store, or uploaded directly by your organization. How did you create a custom Microsoft Teams app? Well, you'll first do the development of the component that supports your Microsoft Teams app. Microsoft Teams apps are web applications that can be created using HTML, TypeScript, or JavaScript, client-side web frameworks such as React, or any other server-side framework such as .NET. Microsoft Teams can be a standalone, or they can integrate with Microsoft Teams. Microsoft provides a JavaScript SDK for interacting with the Microsoft Teams client and Bot Builder SDK for building bots. Once you finish creating the app, the final step is to package and deploy the application. Every Microsoft Teams app contains a manifest file that describes all aspects of your app. The manifest includes the URLs, a unique identifier for the component you've created to implement the application. After creating the manifest, create a package that includes the manifest and associated images to use by the app. The package is just a zip file, and prior to uploading and publishing the package, you need to deploy all of the resources that implement the app. These resources include things such as web pages, web services used within the app, bots, and webhooks. Now in this module, we're going to focus on creating custom tabs for Microsoft Teams. A Microsoft Teams tab enables developers to display rich interactive web content within the Microsoft Teams clients. There are two approaches to creating a custom tab. You can either take an existing web application experience and adapt it to a custom tab. You can also build a custom tab from scratch. Microsoft Teams tabs are simply web applications that are hosted by the provider or the developer of the application. A tab in Microsoft Teams displays the specified web app within an iframe in the Microsoft Teams client. While Microsoft Teams tabs are iframes that display web pages, there are some differences between interacting with the web app within a Microsoft Teams client compared to just browsing the same content in a normal browser. Microsoft Teams tabs always display web content in an iframe, whereas a web page is loaded in any browser. This allows you to create a unique experience with the web app only for Microsoft Teams by limiting where the application is hosted. For instance, you can limit a web page to only be displayed within an iframe from a specified domain such as teams.microsoft.com. Authentication is also handled differently in a Microsoft Teams tab compared to a web app, either via a pop-up or calling Azure AD to fetch tokens. Most websites simply redirect a login provider that typically breaks for custom tabs that are hosted inside of an iframe. Tabs break this experience because the sign-in pages typically do not load within an iframe to prevent clickjacking. Cross-domain navigation is handled differently in tabs from a web app as well. The Teams client needs to validate the origin against a static valid domains list in the app manifest when loading or communicating within a tab. Microsoft Teams tabs can also be styled to match the current Microsoft Teams client's theme, such as default, dark, or high contrast. Developers of Microsoft Teams tabs can also communicate with the hosting Microsoft Teams client using the JavaScript SDK. The JavaScript SDK gives Teams a communication channel with the hosted page and more visibility into its operations and communications. Teams determines where a tab can be used based on its scope. And the scope is going to be defined in the app manifest and can be one of three different values. The first is a team scope. Tabs in channels allow teams to interact with your shared experience. These tabs are referred to as channel tabs and previously known as configurable tabs. When these tabs are added to a team, a user configures the content of your tab experience when the tab is first added to a channel. The next option for a tab is a group chat. Now, channel tabs can also be used in group chats. There are more conversations between two or more users. The final option is the personal scope. A personal tab, it allows users to interact with your experience privately. Now, the content in a personal tab is generally only going to be relevant to the individual user using the tab. Now, this section is going to address the process of creating a tab for Microsoft Teams. Now let's look at what's involved in building a Teams tab. Microsoft has design guidelines for creating custom tabs that include the following. You need to focus on functionality. Tabs are going to work best when they're built to address a specific need. Focus on a small set of tasks or a subset of data that's relevant to the channel the tab is in. You also want to reduce the Chrome. You're going to avoid creating multiple panels in a tab, adding layers of navigation, or requiring users to scroll both vertically and horizontally in one tab. In other words, try not to have your tabs in a tab. Also about integration, find ways to notify your users about tab activity. For example, you could post a message card to a conversation about activity going on within the tab's content. They're also conversational. You want to find a way to facilitate a conversation around the tab. This is going to ensure that conversations center on content and data or the process at hand. And you want to make them have streamlined access. Make sure that you're granting access to the right people at the right time, and keeping your sign-in process simple is going to avoid creating barriers to collaboration and contributions. Once you've designed a great Microsoft tab, the next step is to develop it. Tabs are just web apps hosted in an iframe within the Microsoft Teams clients. Developers are free to use any web technologies and any web frameworks they are most comfortable with to implement the custom tab experience, such as HTML, JavaScript, TypeScript, and using web frameworks such as React or Angular and other server-side technologies. The last step is to deploy the custom tab. Now, unlike other Microsoft Teams extensibility options, such as bots and messaging extensions, developers can upload tabs directly to a team. Microsoft Teams can also be uploaded to your tenant's app gallery for other users to install in their teams. Now, when creating a Microsoft Teams tab, there are some key points that you need to keep in mind. A Microsoft Teams tab is just a web page hosted by the tab provider or developer. No data related to the tab is stored in Microsoft Teams. The developer of the tab is responsible for all aspects of the tab, including data storage, configuration settings, and authentication. Microsoft Teams saves only minimal configuration details on the tab, such as the URLs where the content and the website of the tab are stored and the name of the IDs of the tab. The one thing you may want to consider when building your tab is to implement a user experience that is more like an application and less like a web page. Many websites implement the traditional page-to-page and postback style of submitting and presenting information. The users of your tabs are interacting with your application from the Microsoft Teams client. Now, this can be a desktop or a mobile or a web experience, but all of these experiences facilitate a rich client experience. Using web frameworks such as React, Angular, Vue, and others, you can implement a rich client experience without continuously reloading the page. Now, Microsoft provides developers with multiple tools for creating custom Microsoft Teams apps, including custom tabs. App Studio is one option, and it makes it easy to start with creating or integrating your Microsoft Teams app, whether you develop custom apps for your enterprise or SaaS applications for teams around the world, by streamlining the creation of the manifest and package for your app and providing useful tools like the card editor and a React control library. App Studio is a Teams app that can be found in the Teams store, and it helps developers preview the rendering of cards and visually edit the manifest for a Microsoft Teams app. Now, developers have two options for creating the project and resources necessary to implement Microsoft Teams tab. You can either use Node.js or .NET. Developers who want to create a Node.js-based project can use the Microsoft Teams Yeoman generator. After answering a couple questions related to the project you want to create, the the generator will create the scaffolding for your project. And this option requires Git, Node.js, NPM, and a text editor such as VS Code installed on your machine. Now, developers who want to create a .NET-based project can use the tooling provided in Visual Studio 2017 or later. Similar to the Node.js option, after selecting the project type and answering a few questions, Visual Studio will generate the scaffolding for your project. Now, this option only requires you have Git and Visual Studio installed. Your Microsoft Teams tab may require contextual information to display relevant content, or need basic information about your user, team, or company. The tab may need locale and theme information or need to read the identity or sub-identity that identifies what this tab is, or for some additional context. Microsoft Teams provides two different ways for you to obtain context about the current user or from within a Microsoft Teams client. When loading the content page for a tab, Microsoft Teams can include placeholder values on the URL that the web application can use to obtain context. The web app, once loaded with Microsoft Teams, can use the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK. Now, you can use placeholders in your configuration or your content URLs, and Microsoft Teams is going to replace these placeholders with relevant values when determining the actual configuration or content URL to navigate to. The available placeholders include all the fields on Microsoft Teams context object that's available within the JavaScript SDK. Some of the values available as URL placeholders that are set on the tab are where the tab has been set and configured, while others are set while generating a deep link to the tab. Deep links are a way that you can facilitate tab-to-tab communication. So the slide here is showing you a handful of all the properties that are available to you. And you can see the URL on the slide that explains, shows you a demonstration of how you can actually implement these different properties. You can also retrieve the information listed on this slide by using the Microsoft Teams JavaScript client SDK by calling Microsoft Teams.getContext and then passing in a callback function that's going to receive the Teams context. You can get things such as the current team ID and name, the channel ID and name that you're currently in, details about the current chat ID, the locale of the current user, the theme of the site, etc. And you can see there's a bunch of other ones that are available here for you to use as well. Now, developers can create two different types of tabs for Microsoft Teams, and one type of a tab is a personal tab. That's previously referred to as a static tab. Personal tabs allow users to interact with your experience privately. the content in a personal tab is only relevant to the individual user. Now, a personal tab is defined within static tabs, the static tabs collection of the Microsoft Teams app manifest. These are a set of tabs that can be pinned by default without the user adding them manually. Personal tabs declared in the personal scope are always pinned to the app's personal experience. Now, there's a couple properties here that you should pay attention to in the definition of a personal tab within the manifest. The entity ID is a unique identifier for the entity that the tab displays. This is a required property. The name is the display name of the tab in the channel interface. This is also required. The content URL is the HTTPS URL endpoint that points directly to the entity URL that it should be displayed in the Teams canvas. This property is required as well. Now, the website URL property is not required. This is also an HTTPS URL that is going to be used if the user selects that they want to view the tab in a web page or in a browser. The scopes property is required. This is an array of scopes that are supported by this tab. The property is required, and at the present time, only the personal scope is allowed. Now, if your Microsoft Teams tab is going to load or redirect to other URLs, those must be listed in the valid domains collection. In this first demo, we're going to see how to create a custom Microsoft Teams app that includes a personal tab. Now, we're going to inspect an existing project that already has been created using the Yeoman generator for Microsoft Teams. And we're going to see what the code looks like and how this works. If you would like to see how to create this exact same application, I'd encourage you to go take a look at the lab that is associated with this module that this screencast is associated with. It walks you through the steps in detail of how to go about creating this. So let's go take a look at the code for what was created here. So if I come over here and take a look at this application, what I have is it's created this application. Let's first look at the manifest. So here's the manifest for our application. So our application contains a single personal tab here. And so personal tabs, again, were previously called static tabs, but in the manifest, we're still called static tabs. And you can see here that it's got a name of Learn Personal tab and some default data associated with it as well. Now, what's interesting about this, if I come over here to our tab that was created, so I'll open this up, let's go full screen with it. A couple of things that are interesting about this. We are using the Stardust UI library, which is recommended by Microsoft Teams to implement if you're using React that you can use to build out your custom tab. And what's nice about this too is that it has a theme that they've created for each of the 3 themes that Microsoft Teams supports out of the box: the default theme, the dark theme, and the high contrast theme. A couple of things about this. So what are we doing? So in the state of this React component, we're saving our entity ID, the current theme that has been selected, and then we have a collection of to-do items with a new to-do item that we can also submit to our list. So what happens when this tab loads? It's loading inside of a web page that we'll see in just a minute on our site. In a local web server, and we're going to then our application is then going to load our tab and navigate to that URL, which is defined as the content URL. We saw that a minute ago in the manifest. So here's the content URL for our tab. It's going to go to whatever our local host is. And then, which we're going to redirect this using a secure HTTP tunnel utility. We'll see how that works in a minute. Then our tab is at Learn Personal tab, and I'm passing in the theme, the currently selected theme from Microsoft Teams. So again, let's go back to our tab. So what are we doing? So in our initialization of our React component, I'm first going to go call a method called update the Stardust theme. So the current theme for our application. And I'm doing that by fetching the theme from the query string. I'm also, whenever I'm inside of Microsoft Teams, I'm also going to say that whenever the theme changes, call that same method. And so that method is a little utility method that I've created down here. And what that's saying is it checks to see what the current theme is. And it says if it's the default theme, then use the Teams theme from the Stardust library. If it's the dark theme, then use the Teams dark theme. If it's the contrast theme, then use the Teams high contrast theme. And if we don't know what it is, then we'll just use the default theme. And then I just change the state. Now where that's being changed here is we'll come over here and look at this UI. That's being set right here on this provider. And so that's bound to the actual state. So that way our component will get re-rendered depending and show the correct theme of the hosting Teams client. So what else are we doing? So initially we're setting the state to just have 2 items in our collection and setting the new to do item to nothing. Now the rest of this stuff is just all boilerplate stuff. But if I scroll down a little bit, if you look inside the render method, let's see what's happening here. So I'm using the Stardust React library to write out a header control and an alert control. And that's going to tell us if we are currently in Teams or not, because in our initialization, we were writing out, here's the entity ID, but if we're not inside of Microsoft Teams, then I want to write out that we are not currently in Teams. All right. Then we're going to write out a list, and our list is going to enumerate through all of our selected items and write out that each one of those items inside of our to-do items that we need to do. Then we have a little mini form that we've created. So our mini form has got a label associated with it that's going to say it's our to-do list. And then a little bit farther down, we're going to have an input control that's going to have a placeholder for our new to-do item. And that's going to be bound to the state of new to-do value. His on-change event is going to be used to keep our new to-do state value set to whatever the value is of our input control. So that's just going to get fired every time that there's a change to that control. And then we have a button that when the button is clicked, what that will do is, sorry about that. What our button will do is it will take our to-do items, it will take our existing to-do items, and it will push onto it a new to-do item and then update the state to use our new to-do items and clear out the one that was just added. Okay, so let's see how this can work. So I'm going to come over here to my application, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a process called gulp ngrok serve. So what I have to do, there's 2 things that are running inside of this app, or to facilitate this app and for development purposes. So I have a web server that's being spun up to host my application. Now, what that's doing is that's running our application at localhost. So say localhost :h 3007 with the URL of our tab. So if I open up a browser, actually I think I might already have one open. Yep, there it is. So if I go to HTTP localhost 3007, there we go. So this is our current our application that's running right now. And if I take a look at our tab, so let's go find what our tab was. The URL for our tab is right here, learn personal tab index HTML. So I'll grab that and let's paste that into the URL. And there we go. Here's our tab. Notice that it says I'm not currently in Microsoft Teams because it can detect I'm not in the Teams client. But our application works. So see, it works. And I'll just add a to-do item. And there we go. So our application is working and we can test it. But the challenge with this is that this is not running as an HTTPS endpoint. And the way that we solve that to make it a lot easier is inside of our application, where's the console? We're using a developer tool called ngrok, which is right here. So ngrok, what ngrok is doing is it's creating a public HTTPS tunnel that is redirecting to my local HTTP endpoint. So now if I take this URL right here and I copy it, and I come back over to the browser, and now we can see we're redirecting over to our application. So it's a fully routable URL. Now, what's neat about this is that then we can use this as the URL to test our tab while the ngrok service is running and while on our machine and while our local web server is running as well. So let's go into Teams. So I go to teams.microsoft.com. And we'll use the web client just to simplify things. Now, let's see if we can actually use this tab. So what I'm going to do is I'll come over here, and inside of the app bar here, there's a couple ways we can do this. I can open up App Studio, and I can go to the manifest editor to import an existing app. So let's come over here and import this app that we just created. So that is going to be inside of Learn Teams tab, package, is this zip file that was generated when we built our project. So what's nice about this is that when I open this up, oh, it's going to get confusing. So we don't need this one. It's actually going to be this one. So this is the one that we actually created. The other one was a previous one that I ran. So I'm going to go ahead, open this up. And if I scroll down here, what we can see is I've got some information about this application. So there's Learn Teams tabs. There's the ID for it. I've got some descriptions I can set. And notice these to-dos. These are all coming from, if I go back to our app, these are all coming from the manifest that you see here, right? They're all coming from the manifest. Now, one of the neat things about this is that if I come down here, I can actually do some changes to my application. So if I scroll down, there's my Learn Personal tab, and I can edit this tab. And notice here I can change the name of it if I wanted to. But notice also the ngrok URL has been specified here. Because what happened is that when I ran the build process, what the build process did is it replaced the host name with the current host of the application. So if I decide to make changes in the browser to my application and give it, like, say, a different name, so I'll put it as, Learn Personal tabs, like that, and save my changes. And if I come over here to the details for the app, and I say Learn Microsoft Teams tabs, I can give it a longer name here. I could also take the description and say, this is a sample to learn Microsoft Teams tabs. And then this to-do, I don't need to have this to-do, but we'll leave it as a to-do too. If I do all of that stuff, and if I come down into App Studio, and I save my changes, and I go to download the app manifest that we just created, this zip file has a modified manifest file in it from App Studio. But keep in mind, that does not match what's in my project now. So it has the ngrok URLs in it. So I would want to go in and modify all of that for prior to deploying it in production. Also, with those changes I made, maybe I want to keep them in sync with my project. You just need to keep these things in mind if you're using App Studio, because you're now modifying the resulting package that you're getting ready to install, and not the actual source code that you have inside your project. So I could click install right here, and this would go about installing my custom tab. Or another option that I have is I can sideload my application. So I'm going to choose to do that and show you this example. So what I'm going to do is open up the More Added Apps dialog, and I'll select Browse All Apps. And then at the bottom here, I'll choose Upload a Custom App, and I'll say I want to upload it just for me or my teams. And so let me find that one. That is, yep, that's this one right here. This is the one that we generated from our project, not the one we just modified in App Studio. You can see because the name hasn't changed. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and click Add. And what that will do is that'll add my app. Okay, now that my app has been added, notice here I get that little red dot. What that says is something has been added. So there it is. There's Learn MS Teams. If I select this, I can see that it's loading my application. And I can prove that if I come back over to the console, we can see that we just got some requests for the tab right here, right? So if I go off the tab, we can see there's one request and then there's another request. If I leave the tab, like go over here to Activity and then come back to the tab itself, it loaded it again. We should see, sure enough, a third request down here. So this is just a web page. And it's cool because remember we told it to let us to update the state if the display changed or if the theme changed. Well, let's go change the theme and let's see what happens. So here under settings, watch the background over here. I'm currently in default mode, switch it to dark mode, and you can see the tab actually changed its state. Switch it to high contrast mode, same deal. And it even remembers that when I leave the tab and I come back, all right, so that was under activity. Let's go over here to chat and then go to learn Teams tabs. It's remembering that same theme. Okay. And we can see that it also notices that we are in tabs, and it's showing us the entity ID. It's not showing us that message that says you're not currently in Teams, and everything still works. Cool. So in this demo, what you saw is how we can work with a custom tab that has been created as a personal tab inside of Microsoft Teams using the Yeoman generator for Microsoft Teams. Again, if you want to walk through all the steps of how to go about creating this tab, go check out the lab, because it is going to have the most up-to-date steps as tooling changes and some of the options may change for new features that have been added since the time that this screencast was recorded. In this section, we're going to look at how to create channel tabs and configuration pages in Microsoft Teams apps. Specifically, we're going to compare the differences between personal tabs and channel tabs. We're also going to look at the different capabilities we can do within a channel tab, what the configuration page is and how we can use it, as well as the removal page. Now, in the previous section, we learned the fundamentals of Microsoft Teams tabs and how to create a custom personal tab. And your Microsoft Teams app can also include channel tabs that were formerly referred to as configurable tabs. Personal and channel tabs differ in both how they're used and their capabilities, but fundamentally, they're also very much the same. They both are simply going to be loading an external web page into an iframe. It's how the URL for that page is defined, and where these tabs are available is where the key differences are. Personal and channel tabs differ in both how they're used and in their capabilities. Personal tabs are only supported in the personal scope, while channel tabs can be used within the team or the group chat scope. The content displayed within the personal tab is specific to the individual user and is not intended to be shared with other users in a team, whereas channel tabs can support all the members of a team or a channel. One characteristic of a channel tab that differs from a personal tab is that a channel tab can have a configuration experience displayed to the user when the tab is added to a channel. The configuration page defined in the manifest enables developers to collect any configuration information the web app may need to customize the information shown in the tab. For example, consider a channel tab that displays the contents of a SharePoint list. The configuration page can collect the SharePoint site and list from the user and use that information to retrieve and display the correct list data within the tab. The configuration page is another web page or another web app that the developer must create. The Microsoft Teams SDK allows developers to attach to an event fired when the user saves the configuration information. You are responsible as the developer for saving any configuration information that is going to be needed by your tab. Now, developers can set the tab's content URL and entity ID from this save method, based on the options that are specified in the configuration page. Similar to the personal tab, the content displayed in a channel tab is displayed in an iframe. The URL displayed in the iframe is defined by the content URL specified in the configuration page. The web app can then use the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK to obtain the entity ID and/or the sub-entity ID to determine the content that should be displayed. These properties can be used to implement tab-to-tab communication using deep linking. Now, channel tabs are defined within the Microsoft Teams app manifest file in the configurable tabs collection. And that's because configurable tabs is what channel tabs used to be referred to as. The configuration URL is an HTTPS URL that is used when configuring the tab. Now, that is a required property. The can update configuration property is the value that's going to indicate whether an instance of the tab's configuration can be updated after the tab has been added to a channel. This, by default, this is set to true, but you can set this to false if you only want the tab to be configured when it's added to a channel. The scopes property is an array of scopes that the tab supports. Now, channel tabs can be either team and or group chat for scopes. This property is also required. Now, the SharePoint preview image and the SharePoint supported host properties are optional, and these are used to make the tab available as a web part or a full page app within SharePoint Online sites. Now let's look at the configuration page. This is a web page that you're going to host. Now when a user chooses to add or update a channel tab, Microsoft Teams will load the configuration URL specified in the app manifest within an iframe inside of the Add Tab dialog. Now in this page, you present options and gather information from the user about what they want in the tab. For example, you may let users select an existing app resource, such as a file or a task list, to create resources just for this tab. You may decide a tab's configuration can or cannot be changed once it's been added to a team. This can be controlled within the app manifest using the can update configuration flag. By default, as I said on the previous slide, this is set to true. Now this is an example of a channel configuration experience. The image on the left is a configuration page that prompts the user which mapping site they want to use in the channel tab. The image on the right shows the tab's context menu. If a channel tab doesn't have the can update configuration property set to false, the settings option is going to be displayed in that menu, and it will reopen the configuration page dialog. Selecting this menu option will then let us see the configuration page and update the configuration information for the tab. Configuration pages, just like personal and channel tabs, are just web pages loaded within an iframe. The developer is responsible for implementing the user interface, and similar to the content pages for tabs, the web page used as the configuration page must be permitted to load within an iframe. Now, one requirement for configuration pages is that they must notify Microsoft Teams when the settings have been configured and saved. And this is done by registering a save handler using the register on save event handler. Within your handler that you define for that event, you're going to use the Microsoft Teams.settings.save settings method to not only update the tab settings, but you're also going to use the save event that's passed in to your handler and call the notify success method to make Microsoft Teams aware that the settings were successfully saved and that the tab could be added to the channel. Microsoft Teams tab developers are responsible for saving any and all configuration that your tab is going to need. You're only able to set the public properties on a tab, such as the entity ID, the sub-entity ID, and the channel, the content URL, and the web page URL. Now, this code is what you're going to use to save any of the settings from the configuration page on your web app, as well as notify Microsoft Teams the settings were saved successfully. You're going to register your handler when the Save button is clicked on the configuration page by calling Microsoft Teams.settings.register on save handler. That method is coming from the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK. You can see that it's passing in a save event object. I'm going to use the Microsoft Teams.settings.set-settings to update the settings on the tab that I'm configuring. And then at the very end, I'm going to notify Microsoft Teams that the configuration page completed successfully by calling the save event notify success method. Now, channel tabs can be configured with a removal page as well. And this page is going to be displayed when a channel tab is removed from a channel or a group. Now, developers can use this page to clean up any resources that may have been created when they added the tab to the channel. In this second demo, we're going to look at how to create a channel tab with a configuration page and a remove page in a custom Microsoft Teams app. Now, this demo is associated with a hands-on lab that goes along with the module that's associated with the screencast. So if you want to see the detailed steps of how to go about creating this project and modifying the code, then I'd encourage you to go take a look at the lab. What we're going to do in this demo is we're going to look at the final solution from that lab and kind of poke through the important parts of the code and see this up and running. We're not going to walk through all the individual steps of how to create this as dependencies change and other things, steps may change as new features and new libraries and tools get updated after the screencast has been recorded. So what we did is we created a new project using the Yeoman generator for Microsoft Teams. And we can see what that created by looking at the manifest file. That's created a new configurable tab entry. So we have a single entry right here. And this is working by modifying the existing project we had from the previous demo. Now, what this one is doing, as you see here, is that a configurable tab is really called a channel tab. Channel tabs were previously called configurable tabs. Now they're called channel tabs. So if we take a look at the application that was created, we have, what I've done is I've created one called a config math tab. So what does this do? What this config math tab is going to do is it's going to allow the user to select, let's go scroll down to the UI here. It's going to allow them to select in the configuration page a math operator. Do you want to add, subtract, multiply, or divide two numbers? So I'm using the same pattern that we used in the personal tab that we looked at in the last demo, where I'm using the Stardust UI library and we're monitoring the theme being changed from the Microsoft Teams client so that our application, our custom tab, will match the same theme as the hosting Microsoft Teams client. So a couple of things that are interesting about this. So what's happening here is that in the configuration tab, so let me jump back to the manifest and let's take a look at the manifest here. So the manifest has this configuration URL. And so what the configuration URL is doing is it's saying that when the page is updated, or when the tab is added to a channel, the configuration page should open up this file called config.html. Well, config.html is located right here, config.html, and this is going to load inside of our Learn MS Teams tabs, config mab tab configuration. This file right here that it's loading, that is what's going to initialize and load our config component. Now, our config component, when he gets added to the page, what we have to do is that we have to take any settings that we want to collect from our users, and we need to figure out a way of how we're going to store those settings because Teams is not going to store those settings for us. Now, in our case, I'm just trying to do a poor man's version of this, make it very easy for the settings to be stored. So we're just going to modify the entity ID of our tab. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string here that has the current math operator that they've selected, and then I add in the suffix of math page. So when they make a change to it, when they save their changes on the tab, on the configuration page, I'm going to register this handler to say that when they click save, I want to go run this code. So I'm going to go save my settings for this tab. It passes in the save event, and I'm going to notify Teams that I was successful in saving those changes. If I had other stuff that I wanted to store, if I wanted to store like what SharePoint list they selected or what SharePoint site they selected, things like that, then I would be responsible for storing those things in my application, wherever that lives, okay? When the page initialized, when it first loaded, I'm coming over here, I'm getting the context for this, and I'm changing the state of the component to go grab the entity ID, strip out the math page suffix, and set that equal to the math operator, so that on my dropdown, that I will have it by default to the add method or subtract or multiply, whichever one's been selected. Okay, so now that that's done, now let's go look at our configuration page and how it used that information. So what that did is, you notice here, I've got a math operator that I'm specifying, and then I've got an operand A, B, and a result. Now all I'm doing inside the UI for this is I have one input control, I have a second input control, and I'm writing out what the math operator is. And when the user clicks this button to handle the operand change, what that does is that's simply going to check to see, are you adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing? And whatever you're doing, go run these different math operators. So I'm just taking this value and adding it to this value and then getting the string value back. And the reason why I'm using this as strings is because, well, if I don't know what it is, then I'm just going to write out NA here to say I don't know what the formula is or what the result is. So let's see this in action. So what I'm going to do is let's come over to our console and let's run gulp serve or gulp ngrok serve. And this will take a moment to spin up. Okay, now that our application is up and running, let's come back over to Microsoft Teams and let's install it. So what I'm going to do is browse all apps. We're going to do a sideload install. So I'll do the same thing we did in our previous demo. So let's go find our project. It's our package. There's the Learn Teams tab that was created. Okay, there. So now this one, you see here we gave it a little bit longer description, and we also gave it a longer description as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and say add. I want to add it to a team. So I select which team and I'll say general. Now, here's where the configuration tab is different from a personal tab. When I say I want to set the tab up, well, aside from adding it to a specific channel, when I say I want to set the tab up, what this is going to do is this is going to launch my configuration page. So here's my configuration page that just got loaded. Now, I get to choose one of my different operators. So let's say we want to multiply two numbers. So I'll say save this. And what that does is that added in my new tab called my math tab, and notice that it actually fetched out the values that I want to multiply. So we'll say 5 and 6 should give us a value of 30. Now here's where it gets a little interesting too. What I can do is I can go in and modify the settings for it. So I can come over here and I can click this drop down and select settings to reopen and change the value of what I want to do. Like let's go from multiply to add. And notice now we're adding. So no longer 5 and 6 is going to be 30, it's going to be 11. And the reason why I can have this setting set is because in my manifest file, let's find that manifest file, I can update the configuration set to true. Had this been set to false, that settings option would not have been there. So in this demo, what you saw is how a channel tab is a little different from a personal tab. It's only different in the sense that it is going to allow me to add it to an existing team, and it has a configuration page. And furthermore, notice that it also, when in the configuration page, we were also setting a remove URL. So when I go to remove this tab, I have a custom page that's showing up here. So it says, you're about to remove your tab. And if I go look at the code for this, for my remove page, here's where you can see the text. You're about to remove this tab. Right? So again, the differences between a personal tab and a channel tab is that the channel tab can be added to a team, whereas a personal tab is added to the app bar. And a channel tab has a configuration page and it has a remove page. But the remove page, the configuration page, the channel tab itself, and the personal tab, they all are just loading a external web app from in an iframe. This is just an iframe on another URL. In this section, we are going to look at authentication with custom tabs in Microsoft Teams. We're going to focus also on the OAuth 2 implicit grant flow and how to implement the interactive authentication via a pop-up, and discuss briefly the silent authentication and how we can implement single sign-on within our tab. Custom applications that you build as custom tabs for Microsoft Teams may need to access protected resources. And many of these resources, such as secured HTTP APIs, require that users authenticate and provide an OAuth 2 access token when submitting their request. Microsoft Teams has built-in support for enabling these applications, but the entire application process or authentication process and the flow is the responsibility of the web developer to implement in the web application that is used to implement custom tabs. OAuth 2 is an open standard for authenticating and authorization that is used by Azure AD and many other identity providers. Microsoft Teams tabs can use OAuth 2 implicit grant flows to enable users to authenticate access these protected resources. One thing to keep in mind when building custom tabs that require a user to be authenticated, don't assume that the user in Microsoft Teams is the authenticated user. The Microsoft Teams context can provide information about the current user, such as context hints like the current user's ID, but your tab shouldn't treat that as proof of identity. Remember, a custom tab is just an iframe that's displaying contents of a web app. Your web app can use placeholder values added to the URL by Microsoft Teams, such as the current user's profile name, also known as the UPN or the user profile name. A malicious user could send someone a URL that loads your web app and with someone else's profile in the URL with the goal of obtaining someone else's information. Therefore, you should never treat this information as proof of identity of the current user. You should only use it as a login hint when prompting the user to sign in. Now, many identity providers, including Azure AD, don't allow their login experiences to be hosted within an iframe. And because all tabs in Microsoft Teams are iframes, you will implement a pop-up window pattern to initiate the authentication process. This pop-up should only be initiated by a user action. You should not open it automatically. Pop-ups that open automatically are likely to trigger a browser's pop-up blocker and confuse the user experience. Creating a button within the tab's configuration or a content page that initiates the authentication process is probably your best option. Now, a basic understanding of the OAuth 2 implicit grant flow is a prerequisite for working with authentication in Microsoft Teams tabs. The UML sequence diagram here on this slide is documenting that process. Now, I'm going to walk through this step by step from the top down, so just follow along with me. The user interacts with the content in the tab configuration or content page commonly implemented using a button that will initiate the sign-in process. Now the tab, as you can see this section right here, the tab is going to build the URL for its authentication start page, optionally using information from URL placeholders by calling Microsoft Teams.getContext. This Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK method streamlines the authentication experience for the user. For example, when authenticating with Azure AD, the login hint parameter is set to the user's email address. The user may not even have to sign in if they have done so recently. They may not have to sign in because the Azure AD will use the current user's cached credentials if they're available and if possible. And in this scenario, the pop-up is just going to flash briefly and then disappear. The tab is then going to call the Microsoft Teams Authenticate method, that's this section right here, and registers the success callback and failure functions. Now the Microsoft Teams is going to open the pop-up pop-up window from the iframe, and it's going to load a start page. It's going to generate some random state data. It's going to save it for future validation. That's right, we see right here. And it's going to save it future validation and redirect to the identity provider's authorized endpoint. So for Azure AD, that's over here. That is the login.microsoftonline.com / whatever the ID of your tenant is / OAuth2 / authorize. Now, other applications or other application auth flows in Microsoft Teams, the start page must be on a valid domain that's listed in valid domains list and on the same domain as the post login redirect page. Now, one other thing that's important is that the OAuth 2 implicit grant flow calls for a state parameter in the authentication request, which contains a unique session data to prevent a cross-site request forgery attack known as a CSRF attack. The example here that you see is the example that you'll see in the demo is generating a random string that you'll see that you can use inside of this state. The state can be anything you want it to be. You just want to make it something unique to this session, such as like a GUID or a timestamp with some additional information in it. Now the user on the identity provider site is then going to sign in and grant access for the requested permissions defined in the application's configuration to the custom tab. The identity provider is then going to redirect the user right here to the tab's OAuth 2 redirect page with the access token. And the tab is then going to check that the return state value matches what was saved earlier, right here. It's going to then call on a successful authentication. It's going to call notify success. So this notify success is coming from the JavaScript SDK. And that in turn is going to call the success callback function that we registered up here at the top. What that does is that's going to notify Microsoft Teams that the authentication is successful. And so what Microsoft Teams is going to do is it's then going to close that dialog. And then from there, we know that we're logged in and we can go fetch an access token and use the access token to talk to protected resources. Now, Microsoft Teams, before implementing authentication for your Microsoft Teams tab, you need to configure your identity provider. So in scenarios where Azure AD is the selected identity provider, you're going to need to register a new Azure AD application and define the permissions that the application needs. The user will be required to consent to these permissions to the application when they first sign in to the application. Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK contains an API to initiate the pop-up authentication process. The Microsoft Teams authentication.authenticate method takes in a single configuration object as a parameter, and this configuration object enables you to specify the URL of the page that initiates the authentication flow, as well as the success and failure callback handlers when the process completes. If the authentication process failed, that Microsoft Teams is going to report it back to the user with the error. This includes two predefined failure reasons that are specific to Microsoft Teams. The canceled by user reason indicates that the user closed the pop-up authentication window before completing the authentication flow, whereas the failed to open window reason indicates that Microsoft Teams was unable to open the pop-up window. Now, when you're running Microsoft Teams in a browser, this error is going to indicate that the window was blocked by the browser's pop-up blocker, or it doesn't mean that that's exactly what happened, but it's a pretty good indicator if that's what's happened. You're also free to provide your own authentication failure reasons if you wish. Now, if the authentication process succeeds, you can then refresh or reload the page to show the content relevant to the newly authenticated user or display the error reason. Now let's look at this authentication pop-up page a little bit more. The primary goal of this pop-up page is to redirect the user to the configured identity provider's sign-in page. The pop-up is enabling you to avoid the limitation that many identity providers do not allow their sign-in forms to be loaded within an iframe. This pop-up page can be handled in one of two ways. You can implement a server-side sign-in process by redirecting the user to the identity provider's sign-in page using the HTTP 302 redirect response, or you can use a client-side option. Now, to implement the client-side option, use the window.location.assign method and change the URL of the current page to the identity provider's sign-in page. If your identity provider allows you to specify a login hint, such as Azure AD, you can provide that in the sign-in process by retrieving the user's principal name, or the UPN, from the current Microsoft Teams context. Again, as I mentioned before, the OAuth 2 implicit grant flow calls for a state parameter in the authentication request that is going to contain a unique string to the session that you can use to prevent a CSRF attack. The state can be a random string that you'll check when receiving the authentication response from the identity provider. The recommended practice is to only accept the response from the identity provider if the provided state property contains the contents that match the value that you submitted in your initial request. If they don't match, you may be the target of a CSRF attack. Now that we've covered the authentication process, let's look at the relevant code for each of the parts involved in the pop-up window pattern. And there's really three different parts to it. There's the tab that's going to trigger it. There's the start page for your authentication process that's going to load in the pop-up window. And then there's the end process that is going to be the redirect that the identity provider is going to send back to you. The code on this slide is going to be triggered by the user action, such as clicking on a button within the configuration tab or in the content page for the tab. It uses the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK to call the authenticate method. And this method sets the size of the pop-up window, the success and failure callbacks, and the initial URL for the pop-up page. The authentication start page loaded within the pop-up has one job: redirect the user to the chosen identity provider's sign-in page. Now, the code that you see here is using the adal.js, the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library for JavaScript, to handle this process. You must specify the ID of the application as the client ID and the URL of the page that Azure AD should redirect the user to after going through the entire sign-in process. Notice the code that overrides the display call method. This method is giving me a chance to change the URL the user is going to be redirected to when the login method is called. And in this case, I'm including the scope parameter on the request to ensure that Azure AD includes an ID token that contains information about the newly authenticated user. Finally, the login method is going to be called to start the authentication process, and the login method will redirect the user to the Azure AD authorization endpoint. Now, when the user has completed the authentication process for Azure AD, regardless if they have successful or failed the authentication process, they are going to be redirected back to the specified redirect URL. This code uses adal.js library again to check if the user successfully signed in by trying to retrieve the current user by calling the authcontext.getCached method. And if so, it then requests an OAuth 2 access token from the Azure AD for the specified resource. And in this case, the code is requesting an access token for the Microsoft Graph. If a token is received, notify Microsoft Teams of a successful authentication flow and return the access token by calling notify success method. If a token wasn't received, notify the tab by calling the notify failure with a specified error. Regardless of which method you call, this is going to trigger Microsoft Teams to close your pop-up window and execute either of your previously defined callback functions in the case of failure or success. Now, silent authentication in Azure AD and Azure Active Directory and Azure AD is a simplified form of single sign-on. Its purpose is to minimize the number of times a user needs to enter login credentials while using your app. If you want to keep your code client-side, you can use adal.js to attempt to acquire an ADAL or Azure AD access token silently. And this means that the user may never see the pop-up dialog if they've signed in recently. The Azure AD the adal.js library creates a hidden iframe for OAuth 2 implicit grant flows, but specifies the prompt equals none so that the Azure AD never shows the login page. If a user interaction is required because the user needs to sign in or grant access to the application, Azure AD is going to immediately return an error that adal.js is going to report to your app. And at this point, your app can then show a login button for an interactive login authentication. So if the silent authentication fails, Azure AD gives you that error that can be handled via adal.js and your app. And in that scenario, your custom tab would fall back to an interactive login using the pop-up window pattern. In this last demo, we're going to look at how we can create a channel tab that requires authentication to obtain an access token that will be used to call Microsoft Graph to retrieve all the emails for the current user. Now, if you want to see how to go about building this demo or this example from scratch, I encourage you to go check out the module that this screencast is associated with, because it has a hands-on lab that walks you through doing this exact same thing in the third exercise. What I want to focus on in this demo, in the interest of time, is just the actual code sample that we've created to implement this. Now, let's take a look at the code for this and what we've done. So what I have here is in this manifest, there's nothing too special about this. We simply have a single configuration tab. So it's called our Learn Auth tab. And what it does is in the results, let's come down and look at the actual tab, the tab implementation. That is right here. So our configuration page doesn't do anything, but what our tab does is that it has a button, and the button says get my messages. And once it gets all the messages, what we do is we have a list, and what that list does is it's going to go through all the messages and write out each one of the subject and the receive time from all those different messages. So what happens when I call handle get my message on click? So what that does is that's going to call get messages. Now, get messages needs a authenticated Microsoft Graph client. So how are we going to get this Graph client to go fetch our messages? We're just using the JavaScript SDK for the Microsoft Graph to do this. Now, in order to work with this this client, it has to be initialized and get a access token. So what I've done here is up in the component will mount is I'm initializing the Graph client. So what I'm doing here is initializing the Graph client. I'm creating the auth provider, and it's saying to go get an access token from the current state. If I do not have that access token, then here what it's doing is it's saying go get the access token and set it equal to, or set it to the state. When I get that access token back, then I'm going to call the done callback on the auth provider and pass in the access token. And then that's where the request to Graph will work. But what I have to do is I have to first log in. So what I've done here is I'm saying, if you don't have an access token, then I want you to go log in or sign in. So what does sign in do? What sign in does is it's going to call a method to say, go get the access token. And then it sets that on the state. All right, so what does that do? This is where the authentication process is going to start. If you recall from the slides, the way that we can handle authentication is that we can have a window pop up, open up, that will initiate the authentication process. We can't do it from the tab because any identity provider that we want to use is most likely going to block itself from rendering its sign-in page within an iframe. Because it's a great way to try and hijack someone's identity. So they don't allow that to happen. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to call the Microsoft Teams authentication.authenticate method. And what that will do is that will open up a window, a pop-up window. It will load this URL called authstart.html to start the authentication process. Now, once the entire authentication process has completed, and we'll look at that in just a minute, once it's completed, I will get either a success or a failure. And if it succeeds, then I want to resolve a promise and hand back the access token. Otherwise, I want to reject it and pass back the reason of why it failed. And that's all handled previously that I showed earlier when we call the access token. Here we're getting, let's see where we're getting our sign in to go obtain the access token. So there's our token that we get back, and I'm just going to return it back like this. Okay, so I should also do like if it failed, I should have a try catch here, but I don't have that in this demo. This is just keeping it simple to show you how the auth process works. So what does auth start do? So let's come over here and look at auth start. So auth start is using the Azure AD authentication library, the JavaScript version of it, to initiate the authentication process. So what I'm doing first is I'm creating a configuration object. So I need an Azure AD app that has been configured to have the necessary permissions to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So that's probably something we should go set up now. So let's go do that. So I'm going to come over here to Azure AD, and I'm going to go create a brand new application. So I'm going to say app registrations. Let's create a new app registration, and we'll call this our Teams Graph tab. And I'll say, go ahead and register that. Now, the next thing I need to do is I'll set up in the authentication, I need to set up the redirect URI. Now, unfortunately, I don't know the exact URI just yet because in testing, I'm probably going to use ngrok again. And that subdomain in the ngrok service is going to be generated whenever, it's going to be a random thing that's generated when I spin up ngrok. So I'm going to have to come back and do this in a little bit, but I know it's going to be ngrok.io, and then the redirect URI of where we're going to send them to is going to be authend.html. So we'll look at that in a minute. Now, another thing we can do here is I do also know that we're using the implicit grant. And with the implicit grant, I want it to be able to give my application that's requesting access tokens and ID tokens. I want to allow that. Okay, so I've saved both of those things. And it doesn't like all those stars, so why don't we just do XXXXX. There we go. So that'll work. So now we'll save our changes. So we'll come back and we'll modify that in a little bit once we start testing our app. We also need to give our app permissions. So I'm going to come over here to our API permissions, and we're going to add a permission. It'll be a Microsoft Graph delegated permission to mail.read. So reading the user's mail, I'll go ahead and add it. And just to simplify the consent process, I'll just go ahead and grant permission for it right now. Okay, so let's come back over to our app and let's walk through. One more thing. We actually need to go get the ID. There you go, the client ID. So let's grab that and let's come back over to VS Code and let's paste that in right here. So it knows what app we're going to be logging in with. Okay, so we have our client ID. So we're going to tell Azure AD that this is the app that we're trying to log in against. This is the URL that we want to redirect to. So we're going to go to our ngrok URL, the end HTML, and this is where Azure AD is going to redirect me to upon a successful or a failed authentication. And then I'm also saying that the endpoints that we want to grant permissions to, or I'm going to be requesting permissions for, is the Microsoft Graph. Now, in the code here, we're doing a couple more things. So first of all, I'm saying that I want to get the OpenID Connect identity and the profile back. Those are two of the scopes that I'm requesting right off the bat. So I want to include those in as a scope request in the request. And then I'm also going to check to see if the UPN has been provided in the context for this user. Then I'm going to add that as a login hint on the extra query parameters as well. So if the user is forced to log in, then I want to use the current user that's logged into Teams. I want to assume that that's the person that's going to log in. And then finally, there's the prompt request as well. So I'm going to say, if the prompt has been defined as a URL parameter, then in this case here, I can force a login. So I can say force consent or force selecting the account. There's a couple different options you can choose there with Azure AD. Now, I can override on the configuration object a method called display call. And what that allows me to do is to modify the URL that the ADAL library is creating and going to redirect me to log in. It allows me to modify it before it actually redirects the user. And so all I'm doing is saying, do we already have query parameters? And if we do, then let's add our query parameters on to the existing URL. And then let's just update the current URL and redirect them over to that URL. To kick this process off, I'm simply going to say, go create an instance of the authentication context and go log in. Now, once that's done, I'm going to go through the authentication process. Now, the next thing that we're going to have to do is that once the authentication process completes, it's going to redirect me to my end method. So what I'll do is I'll update my end method to use the same Azure AD app, same configuration, and what it will do is it will check to see, is this a callback? And if it is, then handle the callback. So I pass in the hash, which is all the extra stuff that comes on the URL that Azure AD is posting back to me. If this is the window that opened it up, then I'm going to try to get a reference to the current user. If the current user that's been logged in with ADAL, this method should succeed and give me back an object using the cached information from the user that's been stored in local storage using this handle window callback. All right. Now, the next thing I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to go say, if I've got a user back, then let's go get the token. And so I'm going to say acquire token by passing in the endpoint of the access token that I want access to. And if it succeeds getting a token, I will call notify success on the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK. That will notify Teams that I have a token and it hands it back. And it will tell Teams that the authentication was successful and Teams will go close that pop-up window. Otherwise, if I get an error, I'll let them know what the error is, or I'll just say it was an unexpected failure. Okay? If I didn't get a user, well, I also got a problem with the authentication, so I'll also fail that out. So if this is successful, then what should happen is on my tab, on the Auth start, this method should run. It should resolve the promise, getting the access token back, and again, notice I have my token and I'm updating the state. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to go ahead and come over to the console, and let's do a gulp ngrok serve. And let's grab the ngrok URL that it creates while it's spinning up the rest of our application. And we can go modify our redirect URI for our Azure AD application. There we go, and save our changes. Okay, and now let's come over to the console and wait for this to finish creating our application, creating our local web server, spinning up the ngrok URL and redirecting it over to our application. And there we go. When we see this MS Teams showing up, now we're in good shape. All right, now let's come over to Teams and let's install the app. Let's sideload the app. So I'll come over here, go to upload an app, and let's go app package. There we go. And let's add it to a team. So I'm going to add it to the general team. Now, it has a configuration page. We're not doing anything with it. So this is the default one you get when you create a new tab. I'll just put something in and hit save. All right, now we're in good shape. So here it shows what are recent messages in my user's mailbox. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this button, and what's going to happen is Teams is going to launch the pop-up, redirect me over to Azure AD, but because I'm signed in using the same account that I would sign in with Azure AD, it did what's called a silent authentication. It did not require me to log in again. It recognized that I was already logged in with a valid account. And so it fetched the identity or the access token for the current user, and I used that to go fetch all of my email addresses or all my email messages and display them from Microsoft Graph. Maybe I'd want to modify this to let somebody log in with something else with a different account. Well, that's where the prompt query string value, I could have modified that and say select an account or force the user to log in. Right? Instead, right then, what I did is I left the prompt dialog off, and what that allowed it to do is by setting the prompt equal to none, it tried to authenticate me silently, which it was able to do because I'm already logged in. I'm in the same browser. Even though it's a pop-up, it's using the value in the cookie and what's already stored in local storage from logging into Microsoft Teams as knowing who the current user is. And so in this demo, you saw how to create a channel tab that supports authentication to Azure AD to obtain an access token and get information about the current user's mailbox using Microsoft Graph. That concludes this module. Thank you very much for sticking around, and I hope you actually learned something from this.